Daniel Whitmore never thought of his cabin as a retreat in the romantic sense that people from the city used when they rented glass-walled chalets for a weekend getaway. For him, the cabin was not a novelty or an escape. It was the core of his life. A structure built with his own hands on the land his grandfather had left him, nestled in the low valley where the air carried the scent of pine even in the heat of summer. When he returned from work in the nearby town and walked up the narrow path to his porch, he felt the soil under his boots as something deeply familiar, as if the land itself recognized him. The hills that rose on either side of the valley had changed over the years, once covered in scrub and trees and now dominated by rows of modern homes, but the cabin had remained where it had always been, weathered yet resolute, a silent witness, too. The transformation of everything around it. Daniel never joined the community that sprouted above him, not because he wished for isolation, but because he understood with certainty that he did not belong to their design of life. They had their manicured lawns, their regulations about mailbox colors and acceptable shades of exterior paint, their shared amenities wrapped in neat fences. He had his wood stove, his rainwater barrel, his sketches of structures drawn late at night when inspiration pushed him back to the drafting table. The land was more than a possession. It was a reminder of his grandfather's stubborn vision. The old man had bought the entire valley decades ago, when it was considered useless land, too marshy in places, too rocky in others, and he had carved a modest homestead out of it. When developers came years later and persuaded him to sell the surrounding hills for subdivision, he had agreed only on the condition that the valley floor and a strange sliver of parcels beneath the ridgeline roads remained in family hands. Daniel had grown up hearing fragments of that story, not really understanding why his grandfather insisted on holding pieces of land no one seemed to care about. To Daniel, the lesson was simpler. Some things you do not give away, because once lost, they cannot be recovered. That belief shaped him, first in his career as an architect where he fought for designs that respected the ground they stood on, and then in his choice to live in the cabin rather than in some tidy townhouse perched above. His neighbors rarely saw him, and when they did, it was usually when he was hauling lumber or checking the drainage ditch along the road that wound down to his property. They assumed he was just another eccentric, the kind of solitary man who avoided meetings and skipped the barbecues organized by the Homeowners Association. Daniel did not correct them, and he did not explain that he was not under their authority in the first place. He watched with quiet detachment as their board issued notices about lawn height or holiday decorations, and he could hear their evening gatherings echo faintly across the valley like a reminder of a world he was not part of. It did not bother him. His life in the cabin was full in its own way, measured not by the approval of a committee but by the steady rhythm of the seasons and the satisfaction of seeing wood beams fit into place exactly as he envisioned. There were moments, especially in the twilight hours, when he stood at the edge of his porch and looked up at the rows of uniform houses gleaming under porch lights, that he felt like a man occupying the forgotten root of a tree whose branches had grown wild above him. Yet he never envied them. He had been inside some of those homes once as part of his work, and while they were clean and impressive, they felt like containers more than dwellings, polished shells built on ground that had been reshaped to fit a plan on paper. His cabin was imperfect, but it was alive with memory. The marks of tools in the beams, the weather stains on the siding, the worn smoothness of the threshold where 3 generations had walked. The valley belonged to him not in the way a title deed declares ownership, but in the way that years of labor, care, and history root a man to soil until they are inseparable. That was why, when the first sign of conflict arrived, it struck him not as a nuisance but as a direct threat to the very foundation of who he was. The first sign that something was shifting arrived not with confrontation at his doorstep, but in the form of an envelope tucked neatly between the handles of his cabin's front door, the kind of envelope that looked official enough to demand attention, yet impersonal enough to feel like it had been distributed to dozens of other houses. Daniel noticed it in the fading light of an autumn afternoon, after a long day spent adjusting the foundation beams on a design project he was overseeing in town, and at first he assumed it might be another circular from the county about utilities or a tax notice forwarded late. The paper was thick, the letterhead elaborate, stamped with the crest of the homeowners association that ruled the hills above his valley like a miniature city-state. He had seen the crest before on newsletters left at his mailbox by mistake, full of updates about pool renovations and security patrols, none of which had anything to do with him. He considered leaving the envelope on the table unopened until morning, but curiosity and a faint instinct made him tear it open right there, with the dust of the road still clinging to his boots. The language was both cold and overly ceremonial, as though whoever wrote it was trying to bury aggression under layers of polite formality. It stated that his structure, a cabin situated on parcel 19B, had been found to be in violation of the community's uniform housing standards, and that according to the association's bylaws, all dwellings were required to meet certain aesthetic and structural criteria to preserve property values. The letter concluded with a directive. He was to vacate the premises within 60 days and provide written confirmation of compliance. For a moment, Daniel read the sentences twice, then a third time, because they seemed absurd even on the page. He was not part of their community. His land predated their development, and the HOA had no jurisdiction over him. Yet the wording carried the absolute certainty of authority, written as if his non-membership was irrelevant, as if they were declaring ownership over the valley simply by printing it on their stationery. At first, his reaction was disbelief, tinged with amusement. He imagined walking up the hill and handing the letter back to the board members with a polite smile, telling them they had made a clerical error. But the longer he stared at the embossed crest, the more he felt a slow burn of anger tightening in his chest. The association had gone out of its way to leave the letter on his door, not in the mailbox where it could be dismissed as a mistake by the postal service. This was deliberate, and that deliberation carried intent. He set the letter on the table beside a cup of tea that had gone cold and spent the evening pacing the narrow confines of the cabin, recalling his grandfather's warnings about the developers and their endless hunger for control. The next morning, determined to dismiss the matter with clarity, he drove up the road that wound to the heart of the residential complex, a place he rarely entered unless necessity forced him. The HOA office occupied a sleek single-story building that once might have been a model home, now retrofitted with glass doors and framed mission statements on the walls. The lobby smelled of disinfectant and expensive air freshener, sterile in a way that made him uneasy. Behind the desk sat a woman with an expression practiced to the point of emptiness, and when he explained that he was there regarding a notice left at his property, she handed him a clipboard without looking up, asking him to write his name and the nature of his complaint. He hesitated at the word, then wrote carefully, "Clarification." Eventually, he was led into a conference room where 3 people waited, among them the chairwoman of the board, Melissa Crawford, a woman whose name he had heard mentioned by neighbors in town, usually in tones of irritation or guarded respect. She greeted him with a smile that did not reach her eyes and gestured for him to sit. He laid the letter on the table and explained calmly that he was not part of the HOA, that his cabin stood on land excluded from the development, and that therefore their demand was a mistake. Melissa listened without interruption, her fingers folded neatly on the table, then slid the letter back toward him and said, in a voice that carried no hesitation, that according to updated zoning records his property now fell under the jurisdiction of the community association. Daniel felt the words hit him harder than he expected, because they were delivered not with aggression, but with the quiet confidence of someone who believed they were right. He asked to see the records, and she produced a large laminated map, laid it across the table, and pointed to a section shaded in uniform blue, a block of parcels that included his valley. The lines on the map were smooth, rounded in a way that ignored the natural contours of the land he knew so well. The creek bed that had always served as the boundary between his grandfather's acreage and the ridge lots was missing, flattened into a neat border that swallowed his cabin into their design. Daniel studied the map with rising suspicion, realizing that it was not a map at all in the traditional sense, but a redrawn abstraction, a bureaucratic version of reality designed to erase the stubborn irregularities of history. He told Melissa firmly that he had original deeds proving otherwise, documents that predated the entire subdivision, but she only smiled again and said he was free to submit them for review to the association's legal committee. The phrase, "submit for review," lodged itself in his mind like a thorn. It implied that his ownership, something he had taken as absolute, was now treated as a claim requiring validation by people who had no authority over it. He left the office without shaking hands, his pulse unsteady, and by the time he reached his truck he understood that what he had dismissed as a misunderstanding was in fact the opening move of something larger. The following days only reinforced that suspicion. He received another letter, this time mailed to his official address reiterating the demand with added penalties for non-compliance. A neighbor who jogged past his property mentioned casually that there had been a discussion at the HOA meeting about clearing out the cabin down in the valley to improve sightlines. It was spoken as if his home was not a home at all, but an obstruction to be removed like a fallen tree. Daniel kept his composure in public, but at night he spread the letters and the copied map across his table, studying them under the dim lamplight, recalling the ink-stained hands of his grandfather as he had traced boundaries on survey documents decades ago. Somewhere in those old files, Daniel knew, was the truth they were attempting to erase, and he would find it before their version of reality consumed his own. Daniel had expected some time to gather his thoughts after that unsettling meeting, perhaps days or weeks before the association pressed further, but the escalation came swiftly, as though his very presence in the valley had become a priority target. To be eliminated without delay. Only a week after his visit to their office, he returned from town to find a bright orange notice nailed to the old pine beside his gate, the words, "Final Warning," printed in bold across the top, followed by language that mixed legal terminology with an almost theatrical severity. According to the notice, his continued occupation of the cabin constituted deliberate non-compliance, and if he did not vacate voluntarily, the matter would be referred to enforcement and the property subject to liens. The absurdity of it all would have been laughable had it not been nailed into the bark of a tree that had stood since before the HOA existed, a tree his grandfather had planted as a marker when he first surveyed the land. Daniel tore the paper free, feeling the raw gouge in the wood with his hand, and for the first time he felt not just irritation, but the sharp edge of violation, as though strangers had walked into his home and left muddy footprints across the floor. Determined not to be cowed, he returned to the HOA office 2 days later, this time carrying a folder of documents, his grandfather's original deed, the plat maps showing the valley excluded from development, and the signed agreement with the county that confirmed the sale of the ridge parcels but left the valley untouched. Melissa Crawford was waiting with 2 other board members, their expressions arranged into the kind of politeness that masks hostility. Daniel placed the documents on the table and explained with measured clarity that the land was his and had always been his, that no revision of a zoning map could erase those recorded facts. Melissa looked at the papers briefly before sliding them back with the tips of her fingers, as though they were irrelevant to the matter at hand, and said that while she respected his attachment to the property, the association had authority over all parcels within the designated area of the community. One of the other members, a man with silver-rimmed glasses and the air of someone used to boardrooms, leaned forward and suggested that Daniel consider cooperating by formally joining the HOA, paying dues, and agreeing to bring his cabin up to code, which in practice meant dismantling half of it and rebuilding according to their architectural standards. The offer was made as if it were a generous compromise, but to Daniel it sounded like extortion disguised as civility. When he refused, they shifted tactics. The man in glasses mentioned that non-compliance could affect the title itself, that liens might be placed on the land, and that prolonged disputes could make the property unmarketable. Melissa added that while the board did not want to resort to litigation, they were prepared to defend the integrity of the community. The words were chosen carefully, but the threat beneath them was plain. Daniel left the office with his folder untouched, his jaw clenched, and as he stepped outside he caught sight of two residents lingering near the entrance, whispering and glancing at him with the faint smirk of people who believed they were on the winning side. That evening, as he sat at the table in his cabin with the papers spread around him, he considered the absurdity of the situation. A group of neighbors who lived in houses built decades after his grandfather's purchase now telling him he had no right to the soil beneath his feet. But beneath the absurdity there was calculation. The redrawn map had not been a mistake. It had been crafted with purpose, designed to incorporate his land into their jurisdiction by erasing the inconvenient boundary of the creek. Someone on the board had enough influence with the county office to push through such a change, and they were confident enough to act as though it were already law. Daniel understood that he was not just dealing with overzealous neighbors, but with a system that had learned to bend rules until they snapped into shapes that suited those in power. The pressure did not stop with letters and meetings. Within days, he noticed trucks parked on the ridge road above his property, their drivers watching his cabin under the pretense of conducting infrastructure inspections. Once, returning home after dark, he found orange survey flags planted along the edge of his driveway, as though someone had already begun measuring the ground for a project. The following morning, he discovered that his mailbox had been stuffed with flyers urging residents to support community integrity and remove non-compliant structures. Though the language never named him directly, the implication was clear, and the fact that such flyers had found their way to his mailbox, which legally was not under their distribution, only deepened his sense of being targeted. Daniel tried to maintain his composure, reminding himself that the land was his and that the documents proved it, but there were moments in the quiet of the night when unease gnawed at him. He would sit by the wood stove and hear the distant hum of cars on the ridge road, headlights flickering between the trees, and he wondered if they were watching, waiting for him to falter. Once he woke to the sound of voices outside, low and muffled, and when he opened the door, he saw the shadowy figures of two men walking back toward the road, leaving behind a fresh stake driven into the earth beside his fence. The stake bore no markings, but its presence was message enough. They were testing how far they could push before he reacted. It was then, standing in the cold night air with the stake in his hand, that Daniel realized the fight had already begun, whether he had chosen it or not. He could not wait for the association to reconsider or for reason to prevail. They had drawn their map over his valley, and in doing so they had declared him an intruder on his own land. If he was to remain, he would need more than the memory of his grandfather's words. He would need to turn those words into proof so irrefutable that even their bureaucracy could not deny it. And so, with the documents carefully stored and the stake tossed into the fire as a symbol of his refusal, he resolved that the next move would be his, not theirs. The search began in the loft above the cabin, a space that had once served as storage for canning jars, spare lumber, and the yellowing boxes of his grandfather's papers. Daniel had avoided it for years because every object up there carried the smell of dust and memory. But now he felt compelled to sift through the past as though somewhere within those boxes lay the key to defending the valley. He spent hours at night bent over crates, his hands blackened with old ink and dust, unfolding maps with cracked creases and reading deeds written in the heavy cursive of clerks from another century. Most of it was routine, receipts for livestock, tax records, faded photographs, but in the bottom of a file marked simply Survey, he found a large rolled parchment tied with string. When he untied it and spread it across the table, the map that unfolded was unlike the sanitized diagrams the HOA had presented. It was rougher, drawn by hand, with every bend of the creek and ridge marked precisely, and across the center in bold letters was the notation, Whitmore Family Land, 1923. All rights retained, including subsurface and roadway. Daniel stared at the words, his pulse quickening. Subsurface and roadway rights meant that his grandfather had never merely owned the valley floor. He had kept legal control of the land beneath the ridges where the subdivision now sprawled. The developers who purchased the ridges decades later had only acquired building rights through long-term leases, not permanent ownership. It was a distinction most homeowners would never think about, buried in legal language. But it meant that every house, every road, every driveway that now glistened under manicured lawns was technically built on ground that still belonged to his family. No wonder the HOA was pressing so hard to assert their authority. If anyone rediscovered these rights, the entire legitimacy of the community could be called into question. The revelation did not come with triumph alone, but with the weight of responsibility. Daniel understood that brandishing this document recklessly could ignite panic among the residents who had invested their lives in those homes. But he also knew that without it, he would eventually be erased, his cabin dismissed as an illegal structure, and his land absorbed into the association's empire of bylaws. He needed counsel, someone who could interpret the map in the language of law rather than memory. He drove into town the next morning and visited a small law office run by Claire Hensley, an attorney known not for flamboyant courtroom theatrics but for her meticulous attention to land disputes. Claire studied the map and the accompanying deeds with the patience of a surgeon examining an X-ray. She asked few questions at first, only nodding occasionally, then finally looked up and told him what he suspected. The document was authentic and binding, and while many modern developments tried to extinguish such claims through rezoning, the wording here was unusually strong. It gave his family not only surface ownership but mineral and roadway control, which meant that technically the HOA could not pave or maintain their streets without his consent. Claire advised caution, however. If he revealed this too soon, the board would mobilize its attorneys and the fight could stretch for years. What he needed was strategy. Gather supporting evidence, secure copies of every relevant record from the county archives, and then present the case in a way that left no room for denial. Daniel left her office with a mix of relief and determination, clutching a list she had written of the documents to retrieve. The next week he spent long hours at the county building, combing through bound ledgers and microfilm reels until his eyes blurred with fatigue. Each discovery added weight to his side. Renewal contracts signed decades ago that proved the ridges were leased rather than sold outright, notations by surveyors who had acknowledged the Whitmore boundary lines, and even letters from the first wave of developers acknowledging the unusual arrangement but deciding it was not worth dispute. Piece by piece, Daniel built a wall of evidence that transformed what had once felt like a private family story into a legal fortress. The turning point came not in an office or archive, but in a quiet moment at the cabin. One evening, while reviewing the documents by lamplight, he heard footsteps on the porch. His first instinct was suspicion. Another intimidation visit by the HOA, perhaps. But when he opened the door, he found his nearest neighbor from the ridge, an older man named Harold Price, standing uneasily with his cap in hand. Harold explained that he had overheard board members discussing Daniel's situation at a recent HOA meeting, not as an issue of compliance but as a deliberate maneuver to seize his property before the old lease arrangements could be discovered. According to Harold, Melissa Crawford had stated openly that the cabin will not last another season, and that legal pressure was only the beginning. Harold, though not a friend, admitted he thought it was wrong, and he wanted Daniel to know what was being said. This confirmation of deliberate intent rather than bureaucratic error changed everything. Daniel thanked Harold and returned to his table with renewed resolve. The board was not simply enforcing rules. They were orchestrating a cover-up to prevent the resurfacing of rights that could undermine their authority. If they were willing to erase his home, they might also be willing to bury the truth entirely, and that thought hardened his resolve. The cabin was no longer just his residence. It had become the front line of a battle between history and erasure. The following week, Daniel and Claire compiled a dossier of evidence: the survey map, the deeds, the county records, and Harold's signed statement. Claire explained that in legal terms, what they had uncovered was not just ownership, but a form of leverage. If necessary, Daniel could challenge the validity of the HOA's very existence, since much of its infrastructure sat on land still technically under his control. But she urged restraint, reminding him that the goal was not to destroy his neighbors' lives, but to secure his right to remain undisturbed. Daniel agreed, though privately he wondered whether the board would ever back down without a confrontation that shook their confidence. The midpoint of his struggle arrived not with a bang, but with the clarity of perspective. He was no longer a man defending a solitary cabin against bureaucratic harassment. He was the rightful heir to the ground beneath an entire community, armed with proof strong enough to topple their carefully constructed authority. The knowledge was both exhilarating and dangerous, and as he stood once more on his porch looking up at the glowing windows of the homes on the ridges, he understood that the fight ahead would be more ruthless than he had imagined. The HOA believed they were pushing a solitary man into submission, but in truth they were standing on soil that was already slipping from beneath their feet. The board did not retreat when Daniel uncovered the truth. Instead, they redoubled their efforts with a brazenness that revealed how deeply invested they were in maintaining the illusion of their control. It began with subtle intrusions, small acts designed to wear him down, and then escalated into direct interference with his daily life. One morning, he discovered that the power line running from the county grid to his cabin had been severed under the pretense of scheduled maintenance, though none had been announced. For 3 days, he lived by lantern light and wood stove, until a county worker confided that the outage had been reported to them not by technical crews, but by community representatives, a phrase that clearly pointed back to the HOA. When he confronted the utility company, they offered only vague apologies and a promise to restore service soon, their voices tinged with the kind of hesitation that spoke of outside pressure. Soon after, strangers appeared on his property under the guise of inspectors. They carried clipboards and wore reflective vests, their trucks marked with a generic company name that Daniel had never seen in town before. They walked the boundary lines of his land, planting stakes and muttering about easements, and when Daniel challenged them, they insisted they were conducting a survey authorized by the association. He demanded to see their credentials, and when they refused, he ordered them off the property, but the damage was done. The sight of fresh survey markers along his fence sent a chill through him. Each stake was like a small declaration that his land was already being partitioned in someone else's mind. That night, under the beam of his flashlight, he pulled the markers out one by one and burned them in the fire pit, watching the orange flames consume the thin wood as if erasing the audacity that had placed them there. The pressure extended beyond his land and into the perception of the wider community. Flyers appeared in town suggesting that Daniel's cabin was an unpermitted structure lowering nearby property values, and anonymous posts began circulating on local message boards describing him as a recluse who refused to cooperate with neighbors. The language was careful enough to avoid direct accusations, but poisonous in tone, designed to isolate him socially before the legal battle could reach its peak. Daniel recognized Melissa Crawford's touch in this, the smiling cruelty of someone who knew that reputations could be broken as effectively as contracts. Yet the board's most aggressive move came in the form of a formal notice delivered by courier, a thick envelope bearing both the HOA seal and the letterhead of a prominent law firm from the city. Inside was a lawsuit alleging that Daniel was occupying land within the association's jurisdiction illegally, that his presence constituted a nuisance, and that his failure to comply with community standards threatened the safety and property values of every resident. The language dripped with arrogance, listing penalties and costs that, if imposed, would have bankrupted him 10 times over. It was an absurd claim, one that ignored the evidence he had gathered, but its purpose was not legal precision. It was intimidation. They wanted him to feel cornered, to see the sheer scale of the machine aligned against him, and to wonder whether he had the strength to resist. Daniel did not face this alone. Claire, his attorney, reviewed the filing and noted that while the claims were weak, the association's strategy was clear. They intended to bury him in paperwork, hearings, and motions until exhaustion or financial ruin forced him to surrender. She warned him that such tactics could drag on for years, but Daniel felt no hesitation now. He had the map, the deeds, the county records, and even a sworn statement from Harold Price. He also had something the HOA lacked: patience born of years living simply in the valley, accustomed to working with what he had rather than relying on the endless convenience of committees and contractors. Where they sought to overwhelm him with noise, he was prepared to endure in silence until the moment came to strike. The board, however, did not limit themselves to legal pressure. Late one evening, Daniel returned home to find his access road blocked by a chain strung across two posts, a sign dangling from it that read, "Private Access. Authorized Vehicles Only." The chain was new, the posts freshly driven, and when he cut it down the following morning, he found a second notice stuffed under his door accusing him of vandalism against HOA property. The absurdity would have been comical if not for the calculated escalation, each step designed to provoke him into an outburst that could be used against him in court. He resisted the temptation, documenting everything with photographs and dated notes, knowing that restraint would be his greatest weapon. Still, the harassment wore at him. There were nights when the silence of the valley felt charged with menace, when headlights lingered too long on the ridge road, when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel where no car should have been. He began to sleep lightly, keeping the old survey maps and deeds in a locked box beside his bed, as though at any moment someone might attempt to seize them. The cabin, once a place of peace, had become a fortress under siege, every creak of the wood and rustle of the pines outside a reminder that unseen eyes might be watching. Yet even in the midst of this pressure, Daniel found clarity. The escalation proved that the HOA was not confident in its legal footing. If they were, they would not need intimidation or sabotage. Their aggression was born of fear, the fear that his evidence would expose their overreach and that the residents who trusted them would turn against them once the truth came out. Each stake driven into his soil, each chain across his road, each poisoned rumor in town only deepened his resolve. They had underestimated him, believing that he was an isolated man who could be pushed aside, but what they had awakened was something older and stronger, the unyielding will of a family that had held the valley for generations. By the time Claire scheduled the first court hearing, Daniel was no longer simply defending his right to a cabin. He was preparing to reveal a truth that would shake the ground beneath every house on the ridges. The HOA had forced the conflict into the open, and now he intended to carry it to its inevitable conclusion. The courtroom was not large, but when Daniel stepped inside on the morning of the hearing, it felt crowded with more than bodies. It was heavy with expectation, the weight of neighbors, officials, and the carefully rehearsed confidence of the HOA board, who sat in the front row in their tailored suits as if preparing for a victory they believed inevitable. Melissa Crawford's smile was fixed and polite, but Daniel saw in it the tightness of a performer aware of the fragility of her act. He carried no smile, only the calm resolve that had grown inside him through months of intimidation. And in his arms was the worn leather folder containing the documents that had become both his weapon and his shield. Claire walked beside him, her steps measured, her presence reminding him that while the board had money and numbers, he had truth, and truth was heavier than all the paper threats they had thrown at him. The HOA's attorney began with a voice smooth and deliberate, reciting claims of noncompliance, nuisance, and encroachment, filling the air with phrases like community standards and collective well-being. He gestured toward Daniel as though pointing out a stain that spoiled an otherwise pristine surface, and his words painted the cabin not as a home, but as an anomaly, a blemish that reduced the value of every property around it. Melissa nodded along, and several board members whispered to each other, already savoring the moment when the judge would order Daniel to vacate. When it was Claire's turn, the room shifted. She spoke without theatrics, without the inflated language of the opposing counsel, but with the clarity of someone who had laid brick upon brick of evidence until the wall stood unshakable. She placed before the judge the original survey map, its ink faded but legible, and explained the history of the Whitmore family's land. The valley purchased outright, the ridges leased for development, the subsurface and roadway rights explicitly retained. She laid out county records confirming renewals of those leases, deeds acknowledging the unusual arrangement, and even letters from early developers who had conceded the point but chosen silence. Then she called Harold Price to the stand, and the older man's voice carried the hesitant honesty of someone with nothing to gain but a need to unburden his conscience. He repeated what he had overheard. Melissa speaking of the cabin as an obstacle that must be removed before the truth of the leases surfaced, a deliberate attempt to erase Daniel's presence before questions could be asked. As each piece of evidence was presented, Daniel watched the board members' composure erode. Melissa's smile grew thinner. The attorney's polished phrases began to stumble, and murmurs rippled through the spectators, many of whom were residents who had come expecting a routine affirmation of the board's authority. Now they heard, perhaps for the first time, that their homes, their manicured streets, their entire association stood on land that was never truly theirs. It was not Daniel who encroached upon them. It was they who lived on ground that belonged to another. The judge asked pointed questions, cutting through the association's arguments with increasing impatience. Why had the board ignored the historic deeds? Why had they pursued eviction when ownership was disputed? What authority allowed them to extend their bylaws over land not explicitly under their jurisdiction? The attorney tried to answer, but each reply was swallowed by the weight of the documents Claire had already laid down. The turning point came when the judge held up the map, noting aloud the words, "All rights retained," and stating clearly that the language left little ambiguity. Daniel Whitmore was not a tenant of the HOA, nor a member subject to their standards, but the rightful owner of the land on which much of their community rested. The silence that followed was deeper than any argument. Daniel felt it like a shift in the earth, a recognition that the struggle had reached its peak and the ground had tilted in his favor. The judge declared that the HOA's attempt to evict him was unlawful, that their notices and actions were without jurisdiction, and that their lawsuit was dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, the court acknowledged his rights as landowner and warned the association that further interference would expose them to damages. Melissa's face drained of color as the ruling was read, and for the first time since the conflict began, Daniel saw her composure crack, the mask slipping to reveal the fury of someone who had believed power alone was enough to bend reality. When it was over, Daniel did not celebrate with raised fists or triumphant words. He gathered his documents, thanked Claire quietly, and walked out of the courtroom into the pale afternoon light. Outside, a cluster of residents stood waiting, their faces unsettled, not angry but shaken, as though realizing that the foundation of their lives had been built on borrowed ground. Some looked at him with suspicion, others with newfound respect, and one or two even nodded in silent acknowledgement. Daniel met their eyes without bitterness. The battle had never been against them as individuals, but against the machinery of arrogance that had sought to erase him. He had endured, and in enduring he had reminded them all that beneath the rules and facades there is always the truth of the land, and truth cannot be voted away. In the weeks that followed the verdict, the valley settled into a different kind of silence. Not the uneasy hush of anticipation that had hung over Daniel's cabin for months, but the quiet after a storm, when debris still litters the ground, yet the air feels lighter. The HOA board fractured under the weight of the ruling, several members resigning in embarrassment, and Melissa Crawford stepping down amid whispers that her arrogance had nearly bankrupted the community. Residents, once content to follow her polished authority, now found themselves questioning every decision the board had made, their trust shaken not by Daniel's resistance, but by the revelation that the rules they had lived under for years were built on a foundation that was never theirs to claim. Meetings were filled not with perfunctory nods but with arguments and doubt, and eventually the structure of the HOA itself began to loosen, giving way to individual agreements and direct dealings that felt less like governance and more like neighbors finally speaking to each other without a mediator. For Daniel, the change was subtler but profound. He did not seek vengeance, nor did he parade his victory. Instead, he continued his life in the cabin as he always had, repairing the porch railing, sketching designs by lamplight, walking the property lines with the same patient care his grandfather had shown. Yet, people who once avoided him now approached with hesitant courtesy. An older couple asking if they could confirm their lease terms directly with him, a young family offering to help clear the fallen branches after a storm, even Harold Price visiting again, this time not with warnings but with a quiet offer of friendship. Daniel accepted each gesture with measured calm, never forgetting the hostility of the past months, but recognizing that survival in the valley required more than solitude. It required coexistence on terms of honesty rather than coercion. On a late autumn evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridges and cast long shadows across the valley, Daniel stood on his porch and looked up at the rows of houses glowing with warm light. They no longer seemed like a looming threat pressing down on him, but like fragile lanterns balanced on ground that owed its stability to the land beneath. He understood now that his cabin was not an isolated outpost, but the root of the valley, the proof that history could not be erased by convenience or power. In defending it, he had not only preserved his family's legacy but reshaped the balance of the community itself. And as the first chill of winter rode the wind through the pines, Daniel felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that he was not merely holding on to his place in the world, but had finally secured it.